close your eyes, and let the sound of the Nile carry you back, somewhere beneath the long, heavy silence of 3,000 years of sand and stone. A name still breathes. It drifts across the surface of a river that has never stopped flowing. It rises from the golden dust of a city that once held the entire accumulated knowledge of the known world within its walls. That name is Cleopatra. Not a myth, not a painting on a museum wall. A woman, a mind, a sovereign, a strategist who looked out across the treacherous world of the 1st century before Christ and refused to blink. Alexandria. Picture it now. Wide, colonnaded boulevards cutting through the salt air off the Mediterranean. A harbor where the ships of a dozen nations jostled side by side, heavy with grain, with papyrus, with ideas. And at the heart of it, the Mausoleum, where scholars from every corner of the earth gathered to study mathematics, to chart the stars, to dissect the very grammar of language. This was the world into which Cleopatra VII was born. She was the last of her dynasty, the final sovereign of a 3-century-old bloodline. And unlike every Ptolemaic ruler before her, she learned to speak Egyptian, 9 languages in total by some accounts. She was not content to rule Egypt from a distance. She intended to be Egypt itself. She allied first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. She built a vision of an Eastern empire that her enemies in Rome called seduction, because the idea that a woman could wield political genius was, to them, too dangerous to name honestly. And so history received her through the lens of those who feared her most. Here is the question that has never been fully answered. Does the world remember the woman who actually lived, or the woman her enemies constructed? Octavian had every reason to make Cleopatra into a cautionary tale. A brilliant sovereign allied with his rival was a problem that could not simply be argued away. It had to be reframed, mythologized, diminished. And so we are left, 2,000 years later, still asking, what was she, really? Tonight we will sit with that question, slowly, with the weight it deserves. The sand is warm beneath you. The Nile moves, unhurried and ancient. And her story is just beginning. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. She was born into a world that was already ending. The year was 69 before Christ, and the city of Alexandria glittered at the edge of the known world like a jewel half submerged in sand. The royal palace complex stretched along the northeastern harbor, its white limestone catching the Mediterranean light, its corridors smelling of beeswax and cedar oil and the faint, ever-present salt of the sea. Within those gilded, silk-draped chambers, a daughter was brought into the world. Her name was Cleopatra. She was the 7th of her name, and she would be the last. Alexandria was not merely a city. It was an argument made in stone and papyrus and polyglot conversation, an argument that civilization could be gathered and concentrated in a single place. The museum, the great institution that housed scholars, poets, physicians, and philosophers, stood at the heart of intellectual Alexandria, funded by the Ptolemaic crown, committed to the radical idea that all human knowledge was worth preserving. Its attached library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Every ship entering the harbor was required by royal decree to surrender any books it carried, so that copies could be made. Alexandria traded not only in grain and linen and glass. It traded in ideas. It was here, in the cool, papyrus-scented reading rooms of the Museum, that the young Cleopatra was formed. She absorbed geometry and astronomy and philosophy. She studied rhetoric and medicine, and she learned languages, not as diplomatic courtesy, but as genuine intellectual engagement. She would eventually speak 9 languages fluently, among them Egyptian, the tongue of the people she would one day rule, a tongue that not one of her Ptolemaic predecessors had ever bothered to learn. This was not a trivial detail. This was a declaration, made quietly in classrooms and scroll-lined halls, that the queen, being shaped in those years, intended to be something fundamentally different from all those who had come before. But the world outside those reading rooms was not a place of philosophical calm. Her father was Ptolemy XII, known as Olitz, the flute player, a name offered not in admiration but in derision, a reference to his fondness for music and in the Roman telling his weakness. He was a man caught between a declining dynasty and the crushing, gravitational pull of Rome, knowing that Egypt's survival depended on Roman goodwill. He spent enormous sums lobbying and bribing his way to recognition from the Roman Senate, paying 6,000 talents of silver to Caesar and Pompey to secure his legitimacy as king. To raise that sum, he taxed his own people with ferocity. When he traveled to Rome to secure that recognition, the Alexandrian mob, volatile and fiercely proud, rose up and threw him from the throne entirely. The young Cleopatra watched all of this. She was perhaps 8 years old when her father first went begging to Rome. She was perhaps 11 when he returned with Roman soldiers at his back, the forces of Aulus Gabinius, and used those foreign swords to retake a throne his own political failures had nearly lost. Those soldiers stayed, a constant reminder that the Ptolemaic crown now rested on a foundation of Roman mercy. These were not abstract political lessons. They were lived observations, accumulated slowly. She learned that a crowd, once insulted beyond endurance, could unmake a king. She learned that Rome was not an ally but a creditor. She learned that legitimacy, the kind that could not be purchased with silver or propped up by foreign swords, had to be earned from the people themselves. This was why she learned Egyptian. This was why, when she walked into the temples of Pata and Isis, she did not stand apart as a foreign ruler performing rituals she did not understand. She participated. She knew the theology. She presented herself not merely as the Macedonian Greek descendant of one of Alexander's generals, which is precisely what she was by blood, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the divine protector of the Egyptian people. She was learning in those years how to be a queen, not a figurehead, a queen, and the distinction between those two things, between the woman who wears the crown and the woman who understands what the crown demands, is not a distinction that can be taught in any single lesson. It accumulates. It is built from small humiliations and patient observations and the slow, quiet discipline of knowing when to speak and when to hold your silence, like a blade kept sheathed. Ptolemy the 12th died in 51 before Christ, when Cleopatra was approximately 18 years of age. His will stipulated that his eldest surviving daughter and eldest son should rule together, and so Cleopatra became Queen of Egypt, with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, seated beside her on the throne. But courts are not simple places, and child kings become instruments of the ambitious men who surround them. Within months, a faction had formed around the young Ptolemy XIII, the royal eunuch Pothinus, who managed the treasury and wielded that management like a weapon. The general Achilles, who commanded the Egyptian army, and the rhetorician Theodotus of Chios, responsible for the young king's education and fully aware that a king who does not know his own mind can be given one. This trio formed a regency council with ambitions that extended far beyond mere regency. They wanted Cleopatra removed. She did not yield quietly. She conducted diplomatic correspondence in her own name. She governed. She made decisions. She was, in all practical senses, the Pharaoh of Egypt. But the faction around her brother escalated steadily. Pothinus worked the court against her. Achilles moved the army. By approximately 49 before Christ, she was forced out, declared an enemy of the co-regency, and driven from Alexandria into the desert borderlands to the east, toward the scorched terrain of the Sinai and beyond, toward Syria. Exile is a particular kind of violence. It does not cut the body. It cuts the self. For a lesser person, exile in those borderlands, stripped of palace, treasury, and army, might have been the end of the story. Cleopatra did not accept the verdict of events. In the arid territories between Egypt and Syria, she began gathering forces, recruiting mercenaries, building a small army, sufficient not to retake Alexandria by direct assault, but sufficient to signal that the Queen of Egypt was not defeated, only displaced. By 48 before Christ, she had positioned her forces near Pelusium, the ancient fortified city on Egypt's northeastern border. Her brother's army, commanded by Achilles, was positioned there as well. A civil war stood balanced on the edge of a knife, two armies facing each other across the heat and dust, the entire future of the Ptolemaic dynasty suspended in the distance between two encampments. And it was at precisely this moment that Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He had come pursuing Pompey Magnus, his defeated rival following the catastrophic Battle of Pharsalus. He arrived to find not Pompey waiting for him, but Pompey's severed head, presented by Pothinus as a calculated offering of loyalty. Caesar wept. He moved into Alexandria, established himself in the royal palace, and summoned both co-regents before him, invoking Roman legal authority over the Ptolemaic will. Ptolemy XIII, controlled by his faction, was already in the city. Cleopatra was not. She was still encamped near Pelusium, behind enemy lines, with no safe passage into a city controlled by her brother's forces. She would find a way. She always found a way, but that crossing, that audacious and world-changing crossing into the palace at Alexandria, belongs to the next chapter of her story. For now, in the gathering dusk of a desert evening, a young queen sits in her tent of exile, 19 years old, educated in every field of human knowledge, fluent in 9 languages, carrying the full weight of a dynasty and a people she has made entirely her own. She is not defeated. She is waiting. She is thinking. And here, in this long pause before everything changes, it is worth asking the question that her story forces upon us, the question with no comfortable answer. the one that sits in the chest and will not be moved. In a world where the people closest to you were more likely to be planning your removal than your protection, where trust was not a virtue but a vulnerability, where the person most likely to reach for your crown was the person who shared your blood and your father's face. How does a young queen learn to trust her own shadow? How does she build the interior stillness that does not collapse into paranoia? How does she remain, after all of it, someone capable of genuine alliance, genuine feeling, genuine connection, in a court where every feeling was a potential weapon in someone else's hand? She did it. Somehow she did it. And that sustained effort, that refusal to be broken inward even as she was driven outward, is perhaps the first and most quietly remarkable of all her extraordinary achievements. She had no army capable of breaking through the lines around Alexandria. She had no fleet, no bribed gate, no tunnel beneath the old city. What she had was something far more dangerous than any of these things. She had a mind that refused to accept the shape of the trap, and a will that kept working quietly and persistently, like water finding its way through limestone, even when every surface looked sealed. Julius Caesar had arrived in Alexandria's harbor in 48 before Christ. He came not as a conqueror, not yet, but as a Roman official pursuing the threads of a civil war that had followed him across the Mediterranean. He had chased his rival Pompey here, only to be presented with Pompey's severed head on the docks, a gift from the boy king's advisers who believed they were buying Roman goodwill with Roman blood. Caesar, by many accounts, wept. Not from grief alone, perhaps, but from the cold recognition of what kind of court he had just entered, and what kind of men stood behind the throne of Ptolemy XIII. Caesar moved his small contingent of legionnaires into the royal palace district and called for both co-regents of Egypt to appear before him. The boy king's court sent their answer quickly enough. Pothinus the eunuch, Achillas the general, and the tutor Theodotus had no intention of allowing Cleopatra near Caesar. She was in the desert. She was cut off. She was, as far as they were concerned, already finished. Cleopatra received word of Caesar's summons from across those cordons of desert and sea, and she made her decision with the speed of someone who had been waiting, not in despair but in readiness for exactly this kind of narrow opening. She would go to Caesar herself, slipping past her brother's pickets and into the palace alone, because there was no other way in, and because she understood with perfect clarity that the one who controlled the audience controlled the outcome. The details of how she crossed that distance have been told and retold for 2,000 years. The most enduring version, preserved in the writings of Plutarch and others, describes a merchant's boat moving into Alexandria's harbor as night gathered over the city. The lights of Alexandria lay reflected in slow, broken patterns on the dark water. A man named Apollodorus the Sicilian, her trusted companion, rowed that vessel in, carrying with him a bedroll, or a linen sack, or a carpet, the exact object shifting slightly depending on which ancient source you follow. Inside that bundle, pressed still and silent, lay the Queen of Egypt. Let the full weight of that image settle. A queen who had commanded armies, who had grown up in the greatest palace on the Mediterranean, who spoke 9 languages and carried the bloodline of the Ptolemies, now reduced to silence and stillness inside a length of rough fabric, rocking with the motion of a small boat crossing the harbor of her own capital city. There is no other word for it but audacious. It was, perhaps, the single most concentrated expression of who she was, utterly willing to be humiliated by the moment in order to command the moment that followed. Apollodoros carried the bundle through the palace corridors, past whichever guards stood at the outer gates. And when the binding was undone and Cleopatra rose to her feet inside Julius Caesar's private rooms, the Roman dictator saw her for the first time. He was 52 years old. She was 21. He was the most powerful military commander in the known world. She was a queen in exile, carrying nothing but herself and the absolute necessity of what she needed from him. Ancient sources suggest Caesar was immediately captivated. The word charm appears often, but that word is too light to carry the full meaning. What she brought into that room was not the performance of seduction. It was the presence of an intellect that matched his own, wrapped in political urgency. Egypt was the wealthiest kingdom Rome dealt with, the primary source of grain that fed the Roman populace. Whoever sat on Egypt's throne shaped Rome's stability. Caesar, still mid-civil war, understood this arithmetic instantly. And so did she. What followed was the rapid unraveling of her brother's careful plan. Ptolemy XIII arrived at the palace the next morning to find Caesar in the company of his exiled sister. The accounts describe the boy king throwing his crown to the ground in the public courtyard, crying out that he had been betrayed. It was a display of temper that told Caesar everything he needed to know about which sibling was fit to rule a kingdom Rome depended upon. But Pothinus and Achilles had no intention of accepting this reversal quietly. Word reached the Egyptian army encamped outside the city, and Achilles began marching his forces, estimated at 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, toward Alexandria itself. Caesar found himself with a small garrison, a volatile royal court, and the world's most valuable kingdom balanced on the edge of open war. The siege of Alexandria that followed was a grinding, claustrophobic conflict fought through the tangled streets and harbor districts of one of the most densely built cities in the ancient world. Caesar's forces held the royal quarter near the eastern harbor, a defensible wedge of palaces and docks, but they were vastly outnumbered. Cleopatra remained inside those walls with him, not as a passive refuge seeker, but as the legitimate face of the rule he was defending. Among the most devastating moments of that siege came from a fire set by Caesar's own orders. His ships in the harbor were at risk of capture, and he ordered them burned to deny them to the enemy. The fire spread, reaching the docks, and from the docks, according to several ancient accounts, it consumed a warehouse near the harbor, storing shipments of scrolls, likely copies destined for the great library or private buyers. The exact extent of damage to the library itself has been debated by scholars across centuries, but the image persists, the irreplaceable words of the ancient, world curling and darkening in the heat of a war fought over who would rule Egypt. Through sea fights and street skirmishes, through the tactical pressure of a winter campaign in a foreign city. The alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra held. He needed her as Egypt's legitimate face. She needed him as her military force. And there was something more, something the ancient sources circle around without settling. A bond that was neither purely political nor purely personal, but something in the complicated territory between them. Ptolemy XIII, drowned in the Nile in 47 before Christ, likely while fleeing the defeat of his forces near the Delta. Reinforcements had reached Caesar from the east, including troops sent by Mithridates of Pergamon, and the combined army crushed the Egyptian opposition. The boy king was gone. His younger sister Arsinoe, used as a rival figurehead during the siege, was taken prisoner. The war was over. Cleopatra was restored to the throne of Egypt. She sat on it now with the weight of Rome behind her, and with Rome's most powerful man standing in her palace, and with all of the complicated obligations that arrangement carried. She also sat on it carrying something else. By 47 before Christ, she was pregnant. The child born in that year was called Ptolemy Caesar by the Alexandrians, but Egypt and history afterward would know him as Caesarion, the little Caesar. His paternity was disputed even in antiquity, but Caesar did not deny it, and Cleopatra's display of the boy as living proof of the bond between Egypt and Rome's most powerful man was itself a precisely calibrated political statement. In 46 before Christ, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. She stayed in Caesar's gardens across the Tiber, the Horti Caesaris, bringing her son and the full visual weight of Egyptian royal presentation. Rome was fascinated and appalled in equal measure. Caesar had already unsettled the old republican order. His association with a foreign queen who had borne him a son deepened the anxieties gathering around him. Cicero visited her in those gardens and recorded his personal distaste in letters that survive. His discomfort reads, in retrospect, more like unease with her capability than with her person. She was still in Rome when the Ides of March arrived in 44 before Christ. When the news came of what had happened in the theater of Pompey, of the 23 wounds, of the collapse onto the marble floor, she was in Rome's orbit when Mark Antony and Octavian began their contest over the dictator's legacy. When the Republic shuddered through its final transformation, there is a question worth resting with here, in the quiet dark before sleep. Was what passed between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar a matter of the heart? Was it love drawn from the genuine collision of two extraordinary minds in a desperate situation? Or was it calculation, a queen doing what queens must do when the alternative is extinction? The ancient sources give us both possibilities and refuse to choose. Plutarch suggests genuine affection. Dio Cassius emphasizes political necessity. The truth is almost certainly that the two things were not separate. For a woman like Cleopatra, thinking was feeling, and feeling was policy, and none of these could be fully disentangled. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra was a queen without a throne. When he died in Rome, she was a queen with a kingdom, a son, a reputation that had reached every corner of the Mediterranean world, and a set of enemies that would take the next decade and every skill she possessed to outlast. The carpet and the audacity of the woman who hid inside it had bought exactly that much, a world she was still fighting to hold. The Ides of March had come and gone like a blade through silk. Julius Caesar lay dead on the floor of the theater of Pompey, his body marked with 23 wounds, his toga soaked in the blood of the most consequential assassination the ancient world had ever witnessed. And in Alexandria, beside the slow, silver Nile, Cleopatra had felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not just the ground of Egypt, the ground of everything she had built. The entire architecture of her survival, so carefully constructed over years of exile and war and dangerous alliance, had collapsed with him in a single afternoon dot. She was 25 years old. She was a queen. She was alone. And she had a son who carried the blood of the most powerful man who had ever lived. A child now 3 years of age, whom the people of Alexandria called Caesarion. Little Caesar, a name that was at once a crown and a target. She returned from Rome quietly. The great city had never truly accepted her, had watched her with its suspicious, calculating eyes, had whispered about the foreign queen in Caesar's gardens across the Tiber. She sailed home with her son and her grief, which she did not display. Queens do not display grief. Grief is a luxury afforded to those who do not carry thrones on their shoulders. In Alexandria, she moved with the swift, cold efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for catastrophe since she was old enough to understand the word. Her younger co-regent and brother died shortly after her return. The ancient sources are vague about the manner of his passing. History does not press too firmly on the details. Cleopatra was now sole ruler of Egypt, and Caesarion became her co-regent and heir. Her most powerful argument to a Roman world tearing itself apart. That world was indeed tearing itself apart. 3 men scrambled for the pieces of Caesar's empire. Young Octavian, Caesar's adopted great-nephew, cold and patient and merciless beneath his unremarkable surface. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, competent but outmatched. And Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general, the man who had stood over Caesar's body and turned the Roman mob into a flood against the assassins. Antony was fire and laughter and appetite and ambition wrapped in a soldier's body, fond of wine and spectacle, built like a marble Hercules, a man who felt the world rather than merely analyzed it. These 3 formed the second triumvirate. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and the east meant Egypt was now within Antony's sphere. The next Roman fist that might close around the throat of her kingdom belonged to Mark Antony. The summons arrived in the year 41 before the birth of Christ. Antony, ruling from the east, needing money and ships and the grain reserves of the Nile, commanded Cleopatra to appear before him in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. The language implied subordination, a queen being called to account for her loyalty during the recent civil war, Egypt being reminded of its dependence on Roman goodwill. Cleopatra received the summons and considered it with the slow, deep attention of a mind that sees multiple layers of any situation simultaneously. She had been here before in a different form. Caesar had been the power she needed. She had gone to him rolled in linen, arriving in the dark of night, placing herself at the mercy of a single daring moment. That gamble had saved her crown, borne her an heir, and brought her to the halls of Rome itself. Now there was Antony, and Antony was not Caesar. Caesar had been a reader, a man of deep intellectual curiosity beneath the military brilliance. Antony responded to beauty and spectacle and the grand gesture. If Caesar had been won by the quiet devastation of her mind, Antony might be won by something larger, louder, more magnificent. She did not answer in the manner expected. She did not go to Tarsus quickly, grateful for the audience. She took her time, and then she made herself into an arrival that history would never forget. On the river Cydnus, which flowed through Tarsus, there appeared a barge of impossible luxury. Its stern was gold. Its sails were purple, the color of kings and gods, extracted drop by precious drop from the bodies of sea snails. The oars were silver, dipping into the water to the music of flutes, the sound rising and falling like something not quite of this earth. Beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, surrounded by boys dressed as the winged arrows, surrounded by women costumed as sea nymphs and graces, reclining with unhurried and absolute magnificence, was Cleopatra herself, dressed as Aphrodite, as Venus, the divine beauty made flesh. She was 28 years old, at the height of her powers. The costume was not vanity. It was meaning. Aphrodite meeting Dionysus, Venus meeting Bacchus, because Antony in the Eastern Mediterranean had cultivated the image of Dionysus, beloved of the Greeks. She was arriving not as a queen called to account by a general, but as a goddess greeting her divine counterpart. The people of Tarsus streamed to the riverbanks in their thousands, abandoning the market stalls, the agora, the temples, to watch this impossible apparition drift toward them on the water. And Antony, who had arranged a formal reception in the marketplace, found himself sitting in his curule chair before empty rows of seats. His people had all gone to the river. He sat alone, and the sheer audacity of what she had done to him before she had even stepped from her barge must have struck him with transforming force. He sent an invitation to dine. She replied that it would be more fitting for him to come to her. He came. What followed in Alexandria over the seasons after Tarsus was something the ancient world talked about for generations. They formed what they called the Society of Inimitable Livers, the Amamatobio, a fellowship of two devoted to excess and philosophy and the relentless pursuit of experiences so rare and extraordinary that they could never be replicated. The name was a joke that only supremely confident people make, a laugh at moderation, a declaration that their life together was beyond imitation. But beneath the legendary banquets, the golden-served meals, the drinking games, the philosophical debates lasting until dawn, essential work was being done. Strategic, careful, irreplaceable work. Cleopatra was not merely entertaining a general. She was binding him to her, binding Rome's eastern arm to Egypt, ensuring that every evening spent in her company was an evening Antony spent understanding that Egypt was not a subordinate nation. Egypt was a civilization, ancient and magnificent, capable of producing a woman who made even the mightiest Roman feel honored by the invitation. Their children came, 3 in total. Twins first, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon, names of celestial bodies announcing royal destinies. Then a second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Each child was political act as much as personal bond. Each child was a thread connecting the Ptolemaic dynasty to Roman power, a future ruler, a future argument for Egypt's enduring sovereignty. The culmination arrived in 34 before the birth of Christ, and the ceremony history calls the donations of Alexandria. In the great gymnasium before an enormous crowd, Antony sat on a golden throne beside Cleopatra, who was dressed as Isis, and read the new order of the East. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Caesarion was declared the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, a thunderclap aimed directly at Octavian, whose entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's adopted son. The twins received vast kingdoms, Alexander Helios, Armenia and Media. Cleopatra Selene, Cyrenaica, and Libya. Little Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. These were not merely gifts. They were a vision of the world reordered, of Egypt not as a subject nation but a royal center, of the children of Cleopatra ruling from the Caspian to the African shore. Author's reflection. When two of the most powerful people on earth come together, when a woman of this extraordinary intelligence and a man of this extraordinary force meet on a golden barge on a river in Cilicia, what are we witnessing? Is it love? Is it politics? Is it the rare and overwhelming thing that happens when two people recognize in each other a true equal, after years surrounded only by subordinates and rivals and those who need something from them? Perhaps the question is too small for what it is trying to hold. Cleopatra and Antony were each, in their own way, extraordinary. Together they were something the world had not seen before. Two people who looked at a map of the known world and said, together, what if it were ours? Not merely from ambition, though ambition was certainly present, but from something that might have been the grandest kind of dreaming, the kind that only happens when you are holding someone's hand in an Alexandrian night and believe for one luminous moment that the world is exactly as large and as possible as the two of you together can make it. And perhaps it is the very magnitude of what they dared to imagine that made the collision to come so devastatingly, so irreversibly final. The world had been remade in ceremony and proclamation. The donations of Alexandria had been spoken aloud, witnessed by crowds, carved into the memory of an empire. Her children stood before the assembled multitudes of the East, given kingdoms, given futures, given the weight of crowns they had not yet grown into. She had looked out upon that spectacle and felt something rare, something a queen must be careful with, the sensation of having won. But far to the west, in the cold marbled chambers of Rome, a man was watching. He had been watching for years, and now, at last, he had everything he needed. Gaius Octavian, the heir of Julius Caesar, was not a general in the way Antony was. He was not a man of passionate impulses or grand gestures. He was patient. He was precise. And he understood, better than almost anyone alive, that history is not made on the battlefield alone. It is made in the minds of the people first. The propaganda war that Octavian unleashed was not born in a single afternoon. It had been building slowly, carefully, the way a craftsman builds a wall, one stone at a time. Every dispatch that arrived in Rome from the East was filtered through his interpretation. Every rumor was amplified. Every ceremony, every alliance, every royal proclamation from Alexandria was reframed as a threat, as an abomination, as the work of a foreign enchantress who had bewitched a Roman general and turned him into something unrecognizable. He stood before the Roman Senate and spoke of Cleopatra with a particular fury that was entirely calculated. She was, in his telling, a sorceress, an Oriental queen whose customs were alien to Roman decency. She burned incense to strange gods. She had enslaved Mark Antony not through honest alliance or even the complications of love, but through dark arts that no Roman man could be expected to resist. This framing was devastatingly effective. It stripped Cleopatra of her political legitimacy. She was not a head of state engaged in complex diplomacy. She was an enchantress, a corruption, and it absolved Antony of his choices. He was a victim. His will had been stolen. Rome's anger could therefore transform into something more useful to Octavian, a national outrage that demanded a response. Octavian produced what he claimed was Antony's will, held in the sacred keeping of the Vestal Virgins, and read it before the Senate. In this document, Antony allegedly requested burial not in Rome, but beside Cleopatra in Alexandria. Whether genuine, altered, or invented is a question history cannot answer, but the effect was immediate. The Senate stripped Antony of his consulship and his command, and then, crucially, they did not declare war on Antony. That would have been a civil war, and the memory of Caesar's civil wars still haunted Rome like a wound. Instead, Octavian declared war on Cleopatra, on Egypt, on the foreign queen who had corrupted one of Rome's greatest men. It was, in every sense, a masterpiece of political manipulation. Cleopatra understood what was happening. She knew Octavian's propaganda for what it was, a prelude to war, and she prepared accordingly. The buildup of forces consumed the years between 35 and 31 before Christ with slow and enormous momentum. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a staggering array of military power. Their fleet numbered somewhere between 500 and 900 ships, many of them heavy warships, massive cedar and oak vessels towering above the waterline like floating fortresses. Their land forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Egypt's wealth funded the entire enterprise in grain, in gold, in ships flying the standards of Isis. Cleopatra insisted on being present at the campaign. This decision would later be twisted by her enemies into evidence of Antony's weakness. But the reality was more straightforward. She was the primary financier of the entire war. It was her ships, her grain stores, her treasury that made the fleet possible. The idea that she should remain in Alexandria while her kingdom's fortune sailed into battle under another person's command was something a queen of her determination would never accept. They gathered at the Bay of Actium, on the western coast of Greece, in the summer of 31 before Christ. Actium sits at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, a wide inland sea connected to the Ionian by a narrow channel. It was here that Antony and Cleopatra anchored their great fleet inside the Gulf, and it was here that Octavian, guided by his brilliant general Agrippa, positioned his own forces to bottle them in. The months before the battle were not kind. Supply routes were strangled. Desertion hollowed out the land forces. Malaria moved through the humid summer camps. Officers defected to Octavian, carrying knowledge of the fleet's weaknesses. The advantages that had seemed so overwhelming in Alexandria began to erode, one by one. The decision reached in the councils of war was to fight their way out by sea, not to seek a decisive engagement, but to concentrate their best ships, load them with supplies and treasure, and break through the blockade to fight from a more favorable position another day. Cleopatra's squadron, 60 Egyptian warships carrying the treasury, was positioned at the rear. Crucially, sails were stowed aboard rather than left in camp, suggesting that escape was always part of the plan. The Battle of Actium, on that early September day, began in the morning and lasted through the afternoon. Antony's heavy ships drove forward. The fighting was brutal and close. The northern wing began to collapse under Agrippa's relentless pressure, and then Cleopatra's squadron moved. 60 ships, purple sails catching the wind at last, drove through the gap in the fighting line and out toward the open water. The sight of that Egyptian fleet turning and running shattered whatever remained of Antony's formation. The battle became a rout. Antony himself left his flagship and boarded a smaller vessel to follow her. He caught up with her fleet and was taken aboard her ship. But here is the detail that tears at every romanticized reading of the scene. He did not go immediately to her. He sat for 3 hours alone in the prow of the ship, not speaking, not eating, staring out at the water. What he was feeling in those hours, the collapse of his military life, the burning wreckage of a fleet behind him. No one can say with certainty. When a leader reaches the moment of ultimate crisis, the question does not arrive cleanly. It does not arrive as a philosophical problem to be weighed in calm reflection. It arrives in the chaos of a September sea battle, in the sight of purple sails catching the wind, in the agonizing calculation of a commander who knows the battle is lost and must decide what can still be saved. Was the retreat at Actium a betrayal or the only coherent strategic decision remaining? Was Antony's choice to follow her weakness or the understanding of a man who knew that without Egypt's treasury there was nothing left to fight with? And what did Cleopatra feel, watching the man who had been her equal sail into the horizon behind her, diminished, following rather than leading? History has judged her harshly for Actium. History has called it flight, cowardice, the moment the enchantress led Rome's greatest general to his destruction. But consider what she carried in those 60 ships. Not just gold, the entire apparatus of continued resistance, the ability to build another fleet, the treasury of the wealthiest kingdom in the ancient world. Losing the treasury in a battle already lost would not have saved Antony's fleet. It would only have ensured that nothing remained afterward. The return to Alexandria was somber in a way that words can barely hold. Cleopatra arrived first and sent messengers ahead, as if returning from a victory rather than a catastrophe, to prevent the city from erupting in chaos before she could steady her court. A queen who appears defeated is not merely politically weakened. She is in physical danger. She arrived looking like a queen. She secured the palace. She bought the hours she needed. When Antony arrived, he withdrew into a solitary refuge near the water. Cleopatra had no such luxury. The practical work of survival demanded everything she had. She began preparing her mausoleum, a great tomb filled with treasure, built so that she could lock herself inside with the wealth of Egypt and bargain, or refuse to bargain entirely on her own terms. She negotiated quietly with Octavian through intermediaries, testing what survival might look like on the other side of the inevitable. She never deluded herself that those negotiations would succeed. But a queen explores every available path before closing any door permanently. Octavian's cold and disciplined forces were already moving. His fleet controlled the sea. His army moved through the east. The kingdoms that had pledged themselves to her vision recalculated their loyalties with the pragmatic speed of the experienced. The world that had seemed 3 years ago in Alexandria to be taking shape according to her design was unmaking itself, fraying toward the center. She was 37 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 20 years. She had survived exile, civil war, the death of Caesar, and the slow collapse of a second alliance. The final chapter was approaching, and she intended to face it exactly as she had faced every chapter before it, as a queen. with the full force of a mind that had never surrendered its sovereignty to despair. The sands of Egypt held their silence. The Nile moved in its ancient and indifferent channel. And in the great city of Alexandria, the last queen of the Ptolemaic line sat in her palace and waited, not passively, never passively, but with the focused and terrible patience of a woman who knows that the most important moves are still ahead. The walls of Alexandria did not fall all at once. They crumbled slowly like the edges of a great papyrus left too long near an open flame. First a corner, then an edge, then another, and all the while, within the high sealed stones of her mausoleum, Cleopatra VII Philopator, last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, waited. She had filled that tomb with the accumulated treasure, generations, gold, ivory, cinnamon, ebony. She had sealed the doors herself, and she had told Octavian's messengers, quietly, that she would burn it all to ash before Rome could claim it. That was her final negotiation, her final currency. Not her charm, not the liquid persuasion of her famous voice. Simply this, the threat of reducing Egypt's entire financial inheritance to smoke. Octavian understood. He sent emissaries one after another with soft words and impossible promises. He needed her alive, whole, and presentable so that Rome could see her walk in chains behind his triumphal chariot. That image, the Eastern Queen in fetters, was the last symbol required to complete the story he was writing of how righteous, disciplined Octavian had saved the Republic from the enchanted Antony and his foreign temptress. Without her alive and humiliated, the story had no ending. She understood this as clearly as she had ever understood anything in her 38 years of navigating a world designed to destroy her dot, and so they waited, each one measuring the other across the sealed stone of her mausoleum. It was in those last aching weeks of 30 before Christ that Mark Antony died. He had received word, false or desperately misinterpreted, that Cleopatra was already dead. His legions dissolved and gone over to Octavian. He fell upon his own sword. But he did not die quickly. He lingered, bleeding, long enough to learn the message had been wrong, and long enough to be carried, still living and still hers, to the high walls of the mausoleum. She could not open the doors. Opening them would mean Octavian's soldiers flooding in behind, seizing the treasure, seizing her, and the game would be over in an instant. And so she and her women, Charmian and Iris, lowered ropes from the high window and pulled him up, hand over bleeding hand, hauling the weight of a dying man up the stone face of her own tomb. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, described those watching below, weeping and crying out at the sight of it. She received him through the window. She laid him down. She held him, pressing her face against his, pressing her hands against his body in some wordless effort to share the weight of what was happening. He asked for wine. He asked her to think not of his defeat, but of the happiness they had known. And then he was gone. She pressed her face against the chest of a man who no longer breathed. She remained sealed inside, with his body in the last Ptolemaic treasury, while Octavian's forces completed their bloodless entry into Alexandria. The city did not resist. He was not cruel. He was not theatrical. He simply arrived, and the world reorganized itself around his presence, as worlds tend to do when the winning side has already won. The meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian is one of the most carefully studied encounters in all of ancient history, because so little of what truly passed between them survived. She met him in the mausoleum or in the royal quarters shortly after. Some accounts say she lay disheveled on her bed, her hair torn in the ancient gesture of grief. Others say she sat before him with the composure of a sovereign receiving a visitor, and spoke of her debts and obligations as though the interview were routine diplomacy. What is certain is that she watched him with the same precise attention she had directed at Julius Caesar across the candlelight of 48 before Christ. She was looking for the crack in the armor, the place where ambition softened into something she could redirect. Caesar had been warmed by her brilliance. Antony had been consumed by her presence. Octavian was neither warm nor easily consumed. He was 29 years old and had already, with extraordinary patience and ruthlessness, destroyed every rival who stood between him and the mastery of Rome. He was polite to her, even gentle, reportedly. He promised safety and dignified treatment. And he watched her watching him, and he understood precisely what she was doing, and he felt nothing that could be used against him. It was a careless remark by a servant or an agent grown too comfortable. That confirmed what she had already suspected. She was to walk in his triumph. She was to be displayed in Rome as the living symbol of the Eastern threat that righteous Rome had overcome. She would be dressed in her own robes, her own jewels, and she would walk in chains through the streets of the city where she had once stayed in Caesar's gardens as a queen, as a peer, as the mother of the dictator's son, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, raised in the Museum, trained in the full weight of Hellenistic learning. The woman who spoke 9 languages and had never in her life been anyone's trophy understood in that moment what remained. One decision, one act still entirely her own. She asked Octavian for permission to perform the burial rites for Antony. The request was granted. She performed them with her own hands, with oil and spices and the dignity the dead require, and she had always known how to provide. She gathered her women. She ate a last meal, a carefully arranged final banquet. She wrote a letter to Octavian asking to be buried beside Antony. When he read it and understood its meaning, he sent his men running to her chambers. They were too late. A basket of figs arrived, smuggled past the guards. Inside the basket, nested in leaves, the means of her chosen end. The asp, the Egyptian cobra, the sacred serpent of the goddess Wachet, the serpent that sat upon the brow of every pharaoh and every temple relief carved from Memphis to Thebes. To die by the asp was, in Egyptian theology, not merely to die. It was to be received into the company of gods. The ancient world debated the precise details, and the modern world still debates. What is not debated is this. When Octavian's men broke through the door of her chamber, they found Cleopatra VII dressed in the full ceremonial regalia of a Ptolemaic queen. Her royal robes, her diadem, lying upon a golden couch, still an arranged, composed, deliberate sovereign. Charmian stood beside her, also dying, adjusting the queen's diadem with the last of her strength. A soldier said something sharp. Charmian answered him. She said what he was looking at was entirely fitting and entirely right. For the daughter of so many kings, she was 39 years old. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 275 years, died with her. Egypt became a Roman province, personally owned by Octavian, too important and too wealthy to be trusted to any senator or general. He had won everything he had come for: the treasure, the province, the symbolic victory. She had denied him only the one thing she had left to deny. She had denied him the sight of her walking in chains. And here, at the cool, settled edge of her story, the author must pause and sit with the weight of what she chose. Because the question beneath the question lives, not in political calculation, but somewhere older and harder and more essentially human. By choosing the manner of her own departure. Did Cleopatra achieve her final and most enduring victory over Rome? She had never, in her entire adult life, controlled the full terms of her own existence. She had been born into a dynasty that consumed its own members. Exiled by her own brother, restored by foreign legions, sustained by alliances she had to earn and constantly maintain, and ultimately overwhelmed not by her own failures but by the convergence of Roman ambition and Octavian's cold, total will. Every room she had ever entered, she had entered knowing that the people inside held power over whether she lived or died. Every conversation had been a negotiation. In her mausoleum, in her robes, with her diadem settled on her brow, she entered a room on her own terms for the first time. She arranged her ending the way she had always arranged the things that mattered, with precision, with dignity, with attention to the appearance of things, because she understood that how a moment looks is how it is remembered. She looked like a queen. She died like a queen. And Octavian, standing in the doorway of her chamber, looking at the woman he had intended to parade through the streets of Rome, understood at last that he had not quite won everything after all. History would argue about her for 2,000 years. Rome called her a sorceress. Shakespeare made her infinitely tragic. Modern scholars have recovered the evidence of her actual administration, her economic policy, her linguistic gifts, her religious diplomacy, and her effective sovereignty over a complex, multilingual kingdom under unrelenting pressure. She was not the woman her enemies described. She was not perfume and eyeliner and a golden couch. She was the woman who understood at 9 languages deep what every person in every room truly wanted, and who spent her entire life giving them enough of it to keep Egypt alive for one more year, one more season, one more harvest. She almost did it. She almost kept the last light of the Ptolemaic world burning long enough for something to change. Almost. Sleep now, in the long dark between the stars, and let the Nile carry the thought of her gently into what comes next. She was real, and she was magnificent, and she chose her ending, and that is not nothing. That is, perhaps, everything. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep dream are released here every day.